Okay, howdy, students. I am going to be doing a solo lecture today. Uh, Dr. Shackelford and I were working on our uh, discussion recording, and we were having a lot of technical difficulties, a lot of connectivity issues, um, which should be totally resolved by next week. But for now, I'm just going to record this lecture on my webcam on my own. Talk to you guys about chapters 9 and 10 of the Blind Watchmaker, and yeah, that'll be it for the video lecture this week. I'll quickly, because Dr. Shackelford usually does it, I'll quickly talk about the videos assigned for this week. So it's just parts 3 and 4 of the PBS Evolution series that you guys have been watching, I think, the past 2 weeks. So you guys will watch, and by the time this is uploaded, it's already been, these videos have already been linked on Moodle under the week 6 video links folder. And so it's part 3 extinction and part 3 arms races. So the arms races should help if you still have any lingering questions about chapters 7 and 8. I think the arms race video will hopefully help clear up some of that. And then extinction is sort of a, well, we'll talk a little bit about extinction today or I will, in the discussion on chapters 9 and 10. But yeah, so I won't say too much more about that. Discussion questions going very well, as usual, or as they have been. Reaction paper also going very well, so good job, keep it up. Didn't really notice any consistent questions, like any of the same questions over and over for week 5's discussion forum, so I'm not really going to spend any time rehashing stuff from last week. I did answer a couple questions directly in the last week's discussion forum. So, and if you do, but please, if you are still confused about anything, and you want to be clear on it before moving on, please do send me or Dr. Shackelford an email. I'll be happy to get back to you. It's just I didn't see anything that was consistently popping up from last week's material that I felt like I should address now. So, with that all out of the way, I guess we can just jump into it, starting first with chapter 9, puncturing punctuationism. Sorry for the ASMR. So this chapter is sort of primarily dedicated to explaining some of the more common, widespread misunderstandings of punctuationism and gradualism, or as some people might call it, or as some people might frame it, punctuationism versus gradualism. And I think Dawkins' main thesis in this chapter is primarily to dispel the myth that punctuationism and gradualism are opposing or mutually exclusive. So punctuated equilibrism, whatever, punctuationism, basically an idea forwarded by Stephen Jay Gould, very prominent American evolutionary biologist, evolutionary theorist, who did a lot of writing in the 70s. And he sort of chose to explain gradual evolution by natural selection as occurring in fits and starts, or having sort of bursts of speed, if you will. and he sort of explained that, or he liked to explain evolution as occurring relatively quickly over relatively, and when we say relatively, that means still on a huge time scale, but relatively short periods of time um, under sort of unusually intense selective pressures is where most of natural selection occurs. It's still gradual, but it happens in sort of short bursts like that, and then goes back to like stasis, largely stasis for long periods of time until sufficient selection pressure builds up again, and sort of reaches like a breaking point, and then natural selection is sort of allowed to happen again. And what Dawkins is explaining in this chapter is that that's still gradualism. It's just that you're sort of focusing on very specific periods in history, and choosing to zoom in there and say, well, if you just look at this picture, this is what it looks like. This is what the rate looks like from a constant rate of no mutation or no change to a very sudden shift where mutations or evolution by natural selection is happening very rapidly, and a species changes very rapidly in its form during this period, during this burst of speed. And there seems to be this myth that way of looking at things is in opposition to Darwin's idea of natural selection. But what Richard Dawkins is saying in chapter 9 is that Darwin never said that. Darwin never said that that natural selection couldn't have varying rates, basically. He never said that the rate of change wasn't variable or couldn't change or couldn't be different from one time to another. And it's entirely possible, according to Charles Darwin's original version of the theory, and according to any respectable evolutionary theorist now, there's no reason that there couldn't, at least hypothetically, be periods of time where natural selection is sort of working a little bit harder and changes are happening more rapidly, and there are other times where changes are happening a little less rapidly. The one distinction that Richard Dawkins says, or that Richard Dawkins makes and says that, the one area in which punctuationism is very probably incorrect is that in between those bursts of sort of rapid change, during the longer periods of stasis, according to punctuationism and according to Stephen Jay Gould's version of punctuationism, species are actually resistant to change during those stasis periods, those long periods with very little or no change. Species actually resist, not consciously, but they are sort of, until sufficient selective pressure builds up and forces them to change rapidly, until then they are resistant to any small change whatsoever. And then they, the selection pressure builds up, and then they start changing still gradually, but over a sort of condensed period of time, they change rather quickly, but still over generations. So that's important to emphasize, because Stephen Jay Gould and other people who sort of subscribe to this idea, no one was saying that changes are happening instantly from parent to child, big macro level mutations. They were still saying that it happened gradually over the generations. It was just over a shorter number of generations than maybe other people were arguing. Now, so I can't remember exactly how Dawkins explains it, but I mean, from my sort of perspective and my experience, and from what I've read in evolutionary biology and psychology, is that any random mutation that gives its owner, the body that it lives in, even a very slight advantage in its environment, in competition with the other males in its environment, in competition with attracting females, or, acquiring food and resources, or avoiding being eaten by predators, whatever it may be. Even a very small, slight mutation that carries with it an advantage, however small, should be favored. And that is why I personally, and I think Dr. Shackelford would agree, I don't think it's useful or helpful to think about natural selection being resistant, or thinking about species as being resistant to change until there's sort of a sufficient selection pressure. Natural selection is always on. It's always, it's not like, sure, there could be really, really intense pressure for a certain mutation, such that if the mutation occurs, it'll be greatly favored instead of just very slightly favored. But it's always working. There's always the possibility in a set species that a small mutation, even if there isn't huge pressure to favor the mutation, any small mutation that incurs any slight small benefit to the animal will be favored and then passed down to that animal's children, and then the children's children, so long as they inherit it, and so on. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's sort of the key distinction. I know I'm boiling a lot of the information in Chapter 9 down a lot, but that's sort of the key thing, or one of the key things I think to understand from this chapter, is that for the most part, punctuationism does not conflict with classic, like, original Darwinian theory. The one place that it does fall apart a little, according to Dawkins, and I agree, is in the claim that species will be resistant to change. And hopefully I've done a decent enough job of explaining why that would be. I guess the other thing I should talk about, and this is sort of backtracking because now we're sort of returning. I've been jumping all over the place, and you'll hopefully get a better understanding as you yourself read the chapter. But now focusing specifically on the beginning of the chapter, Dawkins sets up this analogy, parable. Well, I mean, he basically uses a pre-existing story, of the children of Israel being stranded in the desert for 40 years, which is a biblical myth about the exodus from the Israelites from Egypt, and how they wandered in the desert for a very long time until they got to their destination, the Promised Land, which I believe is Israel. I'm sorry, I'm not horribly well educated on Bible stories, but I believe that's basically the idea. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, until they reached their destination, and so Dawkins says right here in the second sentence that it's a 200-mile journey roundabout from Egypt to Israel, and it took them 40 years. And so he says that their average speed was about 24 yards per day, maybe 3 yards per hour, which he explains is incredibly slow. Why is he talking about this? I think basically what he's doing is he's trying to uh, make that sort of constant rate seem ridiculous. Like if you were traveling from Egypt to Israel and you had to walk the entire way, you probably wouldn't walk a mere 3 yards per hour. You would probably get there a lot quicker than 40 years, essentially. But if we assume that it took the Israelites 40 years, we have to figure out why it took them so long to get there. And one possibility is that they would settle down for long periods of time and then get going again and make a lot of ground, and then they would stop for a long period of time, or they would travel at a pretty consistent but extremely slow walking speed of 3 yards per hour, allowing for night stops, according to Dawkins. And what these two different options sort of exemplify is the difference between a sort of straw man version of gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, but sort of an extreme version. So he's setting up these two extremes at the beginning, and he explains that the constant rate idea, that the Israelites traveled, at the very slow rate of 3 yards per hour, or in an evolutionary sense, that a fossil version of a species with 2-foot legs is related to a modern version of the species, or an ancestor of the species with 4-foot legs, for example. And so there must not only be an intermediate, according to a constant speed theory, there would have to be an intermediate species somewhere in the fossil record with 3-foot legs, but there would also have to be a sort of succession of fossils from the 2-foot-legged animals to the 4-foot-legged animals in extremely small increments of, I don't know, a quarter of an inch or something ridiculously small. And what Dawkins is getting at is that imagining this in evolution is pretty much like as ridiculous and unrealistic sounding as the parable with the Israelites traveling at the snail's pace of 3 yards an hour. And what he's saying is that no one who calls themselves a gradualist actually views gradualism this way. But that also doesn't mean that you have to go to the other end of the extreme and say that all of the progress from 2-foot legs to 4-foot legs happened in a fit or an extremely short period of time. It may have, like I've been saying earlier, I don't want to contradict myself. It could be the case that such a progression in any sort of physical adaptation did occur in sort of a burst of speed under intense selection pressure, but it didn't have to. It could have evolved sort of gradually over time, and what we think of as gradual may very well differ depending on how close we're zooming in and what period of time we're looking at in any given species. But the reason, and I guess I should explain this because it might sound confusing to say that the straw man gradualism, the extremely slow gradual rate, it might sound odd at this point in the book to say that this is this is a straw man argument. No one who's a gradualist actually believes this, and yet the entire book we've sort of been explaining that natural selection does take small gradual steps over time, ultimately to the effect of larger, very complex adaptations such as the eye. And the eye must have evolved gradually in small steps. But the distinction, and I'm going to go back to leg length because I think it's better illustrates sort of the flaw in this way of thinking. And Dawkins basically uses the same example somewhere in the chapter. So if if my example doesn't make sense, don't worry. It's probably explained a bit better in the book. So the reason that that version of gradualism is very well or very probably a an unhelpful way of looking at things is because it can be difficult to imagine how such an incremental difference in leg length, just as an example, could incur much of a noticeable benefit to the animal that the gene is working on. So, and we don't. The other sort of important aspect is that we don't need natural selection to work that way because genes don't really work that way. And this is another thing Dawkins explains in the book. I'm pretty sure, but genes can make at least semi-large, relatively large, I'll say, changes. So if there's a slight, small mutation in the gene coding for leg length, it could potentially result in a 1-inch increase, or even a couple of inches potentially. And that's okay. You can account for that sort of thing. That's not, at least based on my understanding, that's not too big of a change to allow a random mutation to make. And similarly for something like the eyeball, you don't have to imagine, for instance, that let's say there's a random mutation in someone born with a human eye, or that's a bad way to explain it. Excuse me. Let's imagine that somewhere in the progression of an eye, it doesn't have to be a human eye, but somewhere in the progression of a complex camera eye like we have, you don't have to imagine that natural selection or evolution works so gradually that someone is born with a mutation that gives them a fraction of an extra cone or rod, like photoreceptor, in their eye. You don't have to imagine that. You can imagine that a single mutation, a single step mutation in the gene coding for photoreceptors in an eye, you can imagine that a single mutation creates maybe a new cluster of photoreceptors, for example, or a new handful of fully formed photoreceptors, because genes do work that way. Simple mutations like that can create, and that's not we're not getting away from gradualism here, a sensible version of gradualism, as Dawkins would refer to it. It's still, these are still small, extremely small steps. But it's also something that's sort of large enough for natural selection to notice, so to speak. It's a mutation that should, or at least could, hypothetically incur some sort of advantage. Okay. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Let me see. Yeah, and my page numbers are different. So he talks about the hypothetical example of an animal, three fossils, A, B, and C, A having a leg length of 20 inches and C having a leg length of 40. So B should be intermediate between the two. So we have an evolutionary growth rate of 20 leg inches per 20 million years. Let's, he's saying hypothetically. And at this slow rate, say 4 millionths of an inch per generation, so even smaller than I was talking about in my example. So this illustrates it a little bit better. This is several pages into chapter 9. So say 4 millionths of an inch per generation. If we assume a horse-like generation time of about 4 years, the gradualist is supposed to believe that through all those millions of generations, individuals with the legs 4 millionths of an inch longer than the average had an advantage over individuals with legs of average length. So very slightly less long. And to believe this is like believing that the Israelites traveled 24 yards every day across the desert. That's a good way of summarizing it. And he sort of goes on to explain why, as I just mentioned, why we don't need natural selection to work this way. We don't need genetic mutations to be so small. And embryology also is sort of part of that, and I'm not sure, I can't remember, I don't think he goes into a whole lot of detail in embryology in this chapter, but embryology is another sort of good way of explaining this or getting at it, because you can imagine, maybe someone arguing against gradualism saying, well, gradualism can't work because, you would have a gene coding for leg length in one leg, but then that wouldn't necessarily translate to the other leg. But because of the way embryology works, and because the vast majority of animals are symmetrical, and that symmetry is sort of, if a gene codes for length in one side of the body, unless there is genetic mutation or something goes wrong, it's going to be the same length in the other side of the body. So again, a single small mutation can create a change in one side of the body that is almost always, because of the way bodies are built in the embryo, is almost always mirrored on the other side of the body. So that's another, I think, important point to distinguish. Another thing that Dawkins talks about in this chapter is saltation theories, and the reason that he talks about saltation theory is not because it is a legitimate version of punctuated equilibrium. It's not really punctuationalism. It's very non-Darwinian, whereas, as I've explained, punctuated equilibria fits fine. It has really, for the most part, no qualms with classic Darwinian theory. Saltationism, Dawkins explains, is often confused with punctuated equilibria. And the reason that's so potentially dangerous to a person's understanding of natural selection is that saltation theories are very non-Darwinian, and they basically propose very large and sudden leaps. And that's exactly what we have been talking about throughout this book that is, not possible by the theory of evolution by natural selection. Big macro mutations are exactly what occur infrequently, and B, when they do occur, are very, very often disastrous or harmful to the animal that they, or the organism that they appear in. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, although Dawkins does spend a little bit of time talking about saltation, but it's ultimately to the effect of explaining that saltation is not punctuated equilibria, and saltation is not a Darwinian theory, and it does not, it does not gel with natural selection as we've been understanding it. Okay, 1 second. I just want to see if there's anything else in this chapter that I think really needs to be belabored any further. I don't think so. No, I won't explain that. There is an interesting sort of idea that Dawkins proposes in here about, why there sometimes appear to be sudden jumps in the fossil record that don't necessarily need to rely on anything like saltation. But it's interesting, but I'll direct you guys to read it for yourselves, and I don't think it's crucial to understanding the main thesis of the chapter, which is, about, I mean, it does help. It does help us sort of distinguish what we mean by punctuated equilibria and sudden changes. But like I said, I'll direct you guys to read that for yourselves. It is interesting. And I think I'm going to say that's good for chapter 9. And so moving on to chapter 10, One True Tree of Life. In this chapter, Dawkins is basically talking about taxonomy, or the science of classifying animals and their ancestors and fossils and whatnot. And he tackles a couple of different main ideas in this chapter. And so the chapter is called The One True Tree of Life, and that's one of the main things he gets at, is that there must be one correct tree of life, one single. There can't be multiple different trees of ancestry from, tracing all of the currently living species on Earth all the way back to the first living organism, or first self-replicating bit of whatever that he talked about in, I think, chapter 6, Origins and Miracles. And, again, as he said, and as we've sort of covered, life, or the sort of precursor replicating thing to life that resulted in all current living organisms, very likely, very, very likely only occurred one time. So taxonomy is sort of the practice of trying to fit everything, again, all currently living species, and then all fossils of the ancestors of currently living species, and fossils of extinct, lineages, dead ends. Taxonomy is sort of the practice of categorizing all of that in a way that makes sense, and placing organisms, ancestors, fossils, whatever, that are more closely related to one another closer together on the tree. And that's basically the summary of what it is. But I think what Dawkins is also trying to convince us of in this chapter is that, to a certain extent, splitting hairs in taxonomic categorization of animals and fossils can sometimes be a little misleading, or it's not always it's not always the most useful or the most helpful depending on what your purpose is, what you're trying to do, or what you're trying to figure out, it's not always the most useful to get hung up on the categorization of certain species. And that's not to say that it's not important or valuable or worthwhile to attempt to place everything in a sort of, at least a relative sense, in relation to other animals, and determining the ways in which that it is related or unrelated, or how closely related it is to other species. It's of course a valuable practice, but I think I think Dawkins is of the opinion that a lot of the infighting, for lack of a better word, the argumentation within taxonomy and the sort of differing schools of thought can sometimes detract from the overall picture, or it can sort of become a goal in and of itself. Whereas I think Dawkins would argue that taxonomic classification is more so, or better understood as, being in service of sort of larger goals of understanding natural selection and evolution and descendants. That was at least my impression reading this chapter. And he also spends some time in this chapter again talking about odds and statistics, and given he does some calculations later in the chapter and says stuff like, if you take these any three currently existing animals, and you try and arrange them in a tree of life, just to visualize, just a tree that just shows how related those 3 or 4 or whatever animals are to one another, placing the two that are closest to each other, as sharing a branch, and then more distantly related, branching off like earlier down the line. There are a great deal of combinations, arrangements of the tree, just with those 3 or 4 species, that are incorrect, and there is only one that is actually correct. There can only be one right answer. And I think he uses some visual examples, some visuals to illustrate that. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. Again, I don't know what my page numbers are, but it's like a ways down in chapter 10. And so he talks about computational difficulties and trying to look at all the possible trees. Only 3 animals to be classified. The number of possible trees is only 3. A united with B excluding C, A with C excluding B, B with C excluding A. When there are only 4, there are still 15 possible trees, but still only 1 being correct. But if there are 20 animals, he says that the number of different possible trees linking those 20 animals together in a tree of descendants that is correct, or of the possible options, only 1 is correct out of the 8. Boy, I don't even know. Of an extremely large number. And it's figure 9 in chapter 10. And so I think part of what he's doing here is explaining one of the many difficulties with creating trees of descendants. Again, he's not trying to say that the pursuit of this, trying to figure out a tree of descendants and ancestry using fossil records, he's not saying that we should give up and it's not useful to do at all. But I think he is trying to explain that there is obviously going to be a lot of difficulty, like his example, just using 20 animals. There are so many different trees that could possibly be wrong. Now, a lot of them can be ruled out. Looking at this figure, it looks like bacterium is the furthest removed organism on the tree. So, any tree that puts bacterium in the same sort of group as dog, fox, cat, tiger can probably be ruled out immediately, for example. And then that alone rules out several different combinations. And so on for, anything with bacterium in, being grouped together with the trees or the octopus and squid or the primates or even any of the mammals or animals. A lot of that can be ruled out. And zooming out, more largely to, include more species, the same sort of process can be used to eliminate a large number of trees, but that still leaves a huge number of possible trees that could be wrong. So that's one way in which tracing lineages and trees of descendants can be extremely tricky and hairy. But another thing to consider that I believe that Dawkins touches on briefly in this chapter, but something that I've heard commonly cited as a complication with trees of ancestry like this, is that rarely, at least insofar as we know, rarely ever like when speciation occurs, when a single species becomes two species, rarely ever is it a clean break, where the two, take a population of a single species, and for one reason or another, it's split in half by like a river or a fissure or something or whatever. Rarely ever does such a clean break occur in nature, so that once a species is separated, they're separated instantly and for good. And then one half of the population evolves and becomes a different species, and the other half of the population evolves and becomes a different species itself, and they never interbreed. And when they reunite, they're two completely different species, and they cannot interbreed with one another. What seems to be more likely, and what has happened, and even what's happened with humans, and I'll touch on that in a second, is that as the species start to diverge from one another, they still interbreed. They interbreed probably less and less as they continue to diverge from one another, but there's still interbreeding going on between the two for some time. So instead of, a lot of trees look like this with a fork, like a clear fork, and, where there was once one species, there are then two later down the line in history, or in the fossil record, or whatever. But realistically, the tree might look more, similar to this, but with little spindles or branches connecting the two legs of the fork, if that makes sense. And that would be representative of the interbreeding, which very likely happens a lot of the time in speciation. Which, again, speciation, he explains it in this chapter, but it's just the splitting of one species into two different species. So in the case of speciation, that's very often what happens is instead of a clean break, you get messy sort of a messy sort of gradual split with a lot of interbreeding going on until, eventually the two species are so distinct from one another that they can no longer interbreed. And the reason I used humans as an example is because there were different species of human, although they wouldn't be called, obviously they wouldn't be called Homo sapiens. They were different species of the genus Homo, and one of these was Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthals as they're sort of commonly referred to, and a pretty large portion of people of European descent have Neanderthal DNA. A very small amount of it, but they still have some. So although humans are classified as a distinct species from Neanderthals, they coexisted, they lived together at the same time, and at least in Europe, they lived together in the same places at the same time and interbred with one another. So it wasn't exactly a clean break, such that we're still carrying some of their DNA. Some of us are. So, I mean, we have evidence that it does exist, or, that sort of speciation happens, is what I'm saying. All of which is to say, what I'm getting at, essentially, and what Dawkins is getting at more broadly, is that because of the messiness of speciation and because of the messiness involved in the descendants of animals over history and over time, makes taxonomic classification difficult. Not worthless and not hopeless. It just makes it a little messy. And I think Dawkins is trying to emphasize that these sorts of things should be considered when scientists do attempt to classify fossils in some sort of a tree, in some sort of a hierarchy. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. I want to make sure there's nothing else important in this chapter that I want to touch on. Okay, and so much later, by pretty deep into the chapter, he talks about the sort of different approaches to classification that I sort of hinted at earlier, and he gives an example of what he calls I just saw it. Oh, what he calls cladeism and traditional evolutionary taxonomy, basically. And he gives an example of two fish and two fish that he calls Jacob and Esau, who diverged from each other 300 million years ago. Esau's descendants stagnated, so they basically remained identical in their form to their ancestral species, Esau, whereas Jacob, the the branching the other species that came from the common ancestor, the common shared lineage, Jacob looks very unlike Esau. So they diverge from one another, 300 million years. One looks very similar to how it did 300 million years ago, almost identical, and the other one looks very different. So then Dawkins says, well, so how should we classify them? The traditional taxonomist would recognize the great similarity between the primitive deep sea descendants of Jacob and Esau, and so would classify them together. The strict cladist would not do that. The deep sea descendants of Jacob, for all that they look just like the deep sea descendants of Esau, are nevertheless closer cousins of mammals. Their common ancestor with mammals lived more recently, even if only slightly more recently than their common ancestor with Esau's descendants. Therefore, they must be classified together with mammals. And so, and then Dawkins goes on to say that he basically sees the value in both of those different approaches. And that's another thing that he, I think, is trying to say in this chapter, is that there may very well be advantages and disadvantages to different methods of categorization and classification, or taxonomic classification, despite the sometimes fervent and bitter fighting between the different schools of thought in taxonomic classification. And I think he's arguing that, therefore, a lot of that fighting or argumentation is sort of useless or not very helpful in the grand scheme of things, because although there is only one true tree of life, although there is only one correct map of descendants in all living organisms, or linking all living organisms, there may well be different advantages or disadvantages in taking different methods to classifying these organisms and their ancestry. And I think that will about do it. That seems to be largely the important pieces of these chapters. So hopefully that all makes sense. Hopefully I didn't miss anything glaring. But if I did, please don't be afraid to email me. If you read this chapter, or chapter 9, or any of the chapters this semester, and there's something that was in the reading material that I didn't cover, or that Dr. Shackelford and I did not cover in the video lecture, and you really would like it to be explained to you, I'm more than happy to meet with anyone in a video lecture and explain it, because sometimes it can help. As clunky as it can be to explain things, in person, or in person like this, it can sometimes help to talk through it instead of just rereading the same passage over and over. Or if enough people email me about something that I missed, or that they feel was not explained sufficiently, I'm happy to upload sort of supplemental explanation videos like this. I'm more than happy to do something like that if it's pointed out to me by anyone. Shoot me an email, complain about it in the discussion boards, whatever. Yeah. So I think that's about it. I think that about does it. I will see you guys next week, and hopefully so will Dr. Shackelford. He should be able to join us or join me next week in the discussion for chapter 11, final chapter of the Blind Watchmaker, and then we'll move on from there to the Goodness Paradox by Richard Wrangham. And I think if you guys are, I mean, hopefully not, but if you're sick of Dawkins at this point, hopefully Wrangham will be a refreshing change of pace. It'll be something a little more different, it'll be something a bit more different. But I hope still engaging and interesting. But we'll get there. We'll get there soon enough. So thank you.